Sirens pierced the peaceful hum of my ranch morning like a rusty nail scraping glass. I looked up from my coffee on the porch and saw red and blue lights bouncing off the rows of hay bales I'd stacked the night before. One patrol car, two, then a third. My hand instinctively reached for the badge on my belt before I remembered I'd left it inside with my phone. I stood there in dusty boots, worn jeans, and a flannel shirt as Deputy Mackenzie approached me with his notepad, looking as confused as a squirrel in a swimming pool. "Sheriff, we got a call about unauthorized agricultural structures on this property," he muttered without looking me in the eye. I raised an eyebrow and pointed toward the hay bales, sitting neatly where they always did. The wind rustled through the grass like it was laughing in disbelief. Before I could say a word, the source of chaos strutted around the side of the patrol car in full suburban warrior regalia, beige visor, polo shirt, clipboard tucked under one arm, phone recording with the other. It was her, Karen, self-declared queen of covenants and enforcer of all that is beige and lifeless. "There are at least 14 hay bales stacked in plain view," she barked, arms crossed like she was about to condemn a condemned man. "It's a violation of community standards. This isn't a livestock zone, this is residential adjacent." I blinked. She was serious. "Ma'am, this is private property zoned agricultural." Deputy Mackenzie began hesitantly, trying to figure out what she was even referencing. "That's what I told your boss here," she snapped, pointing at me. Her finger hovered inches from my chest, like she was about to banish me to HOA hell. "I see she doesn't know who I am," I said, smiling a little. I extended a hand. "Sheriff Carson, ma'am, county jurisdiction." She squinted at me like I'd just told her I was the president of Mars. You're the sheriff." Her mouth opened and closed twice. She actually looked at Deputy Mackenzie for confirmation, who nodded awkwardly. "Yes, ma'am, he owns this land, and he's the elected county sheriff." Karen's face turned red so fast I thought she might combust. Well, I still called the police," she stammered. "You did," I said calmly, "and you got them." It would have been funny if it wasn't so sad. Karen had moved into the edge of ranch country just 3 months ago, a cookie-cutter home perched right where the dirt turned into gravel, her entire worldview apparently shattered by the sight of actual farm equipment on an actual farm. She started pacing circles, stomping through the tall grass like she was going to trample the problem into submission. "I've filed official complaints with the HOA," she said, "and with the zoning board, and I will be contacting the local news." I tilted my head and gave her the kind of smile I usually reserved for folks who accidentally sat on porcupines. "I hate to tell you this, ma'am, but we don't have an HOA out here. Your property's on unincorporated land. You can try Channel 5, but they already did a special on my goats last summer. They were a hit." Karen stopped mid-step and slowly turned back to me. Her eyes narrowed, then widened, then narrowed again like a confused security camera. I could almost hear her internal operating system crashing. "I will not live next to hay," she hissed. "It attracts bugs. It's a fire hazard. It's unsightly." "It's hay," I said. She stormed off, muttering into her phone, and I could hear the words community justice and petition floating in the wind. I turned back to Mackenzie, who looked like he wanted to disappear into his uniform. "She's filed 3 complaints in 2 weeks, sir," he said, "about your barn lights being too bright, your fence being too rustic, and something about your windmill spinning aggressively." "Aggressively spinning windmills, that's a new one," I chuckled, and clapped him on the shoulder. "Thanks, Mac, I'll handle it from here." Karen had walked straight back to her yard, pacing in front of her white vinyl fence. She suddenly turned back and shouted across the open field, "You haven't heard the last of me." "I believe you," I said, just loud enough to carry. By the time I walked back inside, I knew 2 things. 1, this woman had far too much time on her hands, and 2, she was about to make the worst mistake of her life by trying to play legal hardball with someone who carried the law in his front pocket and backup in the barn. That evening I sat at my desk reviewing reports while the sun dipped behind the hills, casting golden light on the hay bales Karen loathed so much. There was something satisfying about them, lined up with military precision. Each one represented a week of honest work and 100 reasons why no HOA paper pusher could tell me what to do with my land. My phone buzzed. An email popped up from the county zoning department, forwarded from a civilian. Karen had submitted a digital petition with 3 signatures and a lengthy list of hair-related grievances. It ended with a demand that the sheriff himself be investigated for environmental negligence. I laughed so hard I nearly fell out of my chair. She really had no idea what she was up against. The thing about folks like Karen is they think rules are their weapon and other people are obstacles to be pushed around, but they forget that some of us are the ones who write the rules, and when you push us too far we don't push back, we bury you in procedure citations and airtight codes that don't just win arguments, they end careers. I stood up and walked out to the porch, watching the stars come out above the pasture. Somewhere an owl hooted and the wind whispered through the trees. Karen wanted a fight, she was going to get one. But it wouldn't be the kind she expected. It was going to be legal, quiet, methodical, and devastating. And it all started with hay bales. The battle lines were drawn. Tomorrow the war would begin. The next morning started off with the unmistakable sound of tires crunching over gravel, followed by the slap of something plastic hitting my front gate. I walked out still holding my coffee and found a laminated notice zip-tied to the post. In oversized block letters, it read, "Violation Notice. Unauthorized agricultural display, immediate removal required." There was no county seal, no contact info, and no legal authority anywhere on the page. It was signed in curly, glitter gel pen with, "The Interim HOA Beautification Chair, Karen." I stared at it for a moment before chuckling and tossing it in the burn barrel beside the shed. I figured she was just blowing off steam. But I was wrong. Karen wasn't just puffing her chest. She was rallying. By noon, 3 of my neighbors had called to tell me they'd received similar notices. Doug, whose cattle had lived on his land since Nixon was in office, was fuming. "She put a pink violation tag on my steer," he said. "My damn steer." Another neighbor, June, reported that Karen had left a pamphlet on her door titled "Vision for a Cleaner Community." It included diagrams of the ideal landscape, which looked suspiciously like a golf course and not at all like the wild prairie we lived on. Then came the kicker. Karen posted a public bulletin on the community Facebook group that read, "Due to increasing concern over rural blight, we will be enforcing new neighborhood standards. Residents are expected to comply with visual uniformity guidelines. Noncompliance may result in further action." The kicker was that she wasn't even an admin on that page. She'd hacked it after reporting the actual moderator for spamming photos of chickens. Now it was getting serious. I hopped in my truck and drove down to the feed store where a lot of local ranchers congregated. Sure enough, the bulletin board had Karen's flyers plastered over it. One showed a photoshopped version of my hay bales with giant red XS through them. Another showed a man in a cowboy hat scratching his head with the caption, "Are you the problem in our neighborhood?" I pulled a few of the flyers down, but I left one. Evidence. When I got back to the ranch, I noticed something else. One of my tarps had been untied. Not cut, just loosened, like someone had crept out and inspected the bales, maybe hoping to find something they could report. I walked the property and found fresh boot prints by the northeast corner. Too small to be mine, too clumsy to be any ranch hand. Karen had been snooping. I checked the trail cam footage and sure enough, there she was, creeping onto my land at around 2:17 a.m., wearing all black like she thought she was in some spy movie. She crouched next to the hay, sniffed it, poked it with a stick, then wrote something down in a notebook before vanishing back into the brush. The next day, a new Hay Health Alert flyer appeared on several mailboxes. It warned of mold-induced respiratory threats from improperly stored agricultural materials and claimed that exposure could cause serious lung collapse in children under 12. She cited a medical journal that didn't exist and listed her own email as the concerned environmental contact. At this point, it wasn't just laughable, it was criminal. I drove into town and met with the assistant county attorney. He looked over the flyers, photos, and video and leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temple. "She's impersonating a governing body," he said, "and disseminating false health information. That's easily 2 misdemeanors, maybe 3 if she keeps trespassing." I told him I wasn't looking to press charges yet. Not unless she escalated again. He nodded and said he'd start a file anyway, just in case. But Karen wasn't done. That weekend, I went to the farmer's market to pick up some fencing supplies and noticed a commotion near the gazebo. Karen had set up a folding table covered in printed materials and a donation jar labeled Legal Fund, HOA Development. She had a volunteer handing out cupcakes and another passing out a petition demanding the removal of toxic hay and unsightly debris from rural fringe zones. I stood behind the crowd for a while and just listened. She told one man I was an absentee landlord who hoarded property to lower nearby values for tax break. She told another I was under investigation for endangering livestock. That one almost made me laugh out loud. Once she spotted me, she tried to pivot. She held out a clipboard like she wanted me to sign her petition. "We're cleaning up the community," she said with a toothy smile. "It's time for standards that reflect the modern countryside." I took the clipboard, looked at the name at the top, Karen L. Whitford, HLA Beautification Chair, and flipped to the last page. Only 5 signatures. One of them was obviously hers. Another was Mr. Snuffles, likely her cat. Then I turned to the crowd. "Morning, folks," I said calmly. "As many of you know, I'm Sheriff Carson. Just want to clarify something for the record. There is no HOA on the unincorporated outskirts of this county. These flyers are unauthorized, and the woman distributing them has been caught trespassing and forging official documents. If you've donated money to this jar, you've just funded fraud." Karen's face fell like a rotted pumpkin. She tried to snatch the clipboard back, but I handed it to Deputy Mackenzie, who'd arrived just in time for the show. He nodded and started reviewing the pages. The crowd went quiet, then murmured. A few folks stepped away. One man retrieved a 5 from the donation jar when Karen wasn't looking. She tried to recover by shouting about deep corruption and cowboy cover-ups, but nobody was listening anymore. A local reporter who'd been snapping photos took a direct picture of her yelling, arms flailing, with the banner reading "Ban the Bales" behind her. It was a ridiculous image. Within hours, it was up on social media, captioned, "This ain't the suburb, sweetheart." That night, I got a text from June. The image had gone viral across 3 rancher forums, and even made it to a meme page with thousands of followers. Karen's expression had been captioned with things like, "When the hay is too spicy," and "Karen discovers agriculture." But I didn't feel smug. Not yet. Because I knew something about people like her. Public embarrassment didn't discourage them. It triggered them. I knew Karen would be back. And I had the feeling her next move would go far beyond fake flyers and donation jars. She'd declared war on hay. And soon enough, she'd try something so absurd, so outrageous, that it'd leave us no choice but to bury her in the one thing she hated most. Consequences. 3 days later, I woke up to a strange silence. Not the peaceful kind where the morning mist wraps around the barn like a blanket, but the eerie kind, the type that makes your skin prickle before your brain catches up. I walked outside with my coffee and froze mid-step. 1/3 of my hay bales were gone. Vanished. The row that had been stacked perfectly along the eastern fence line was missing, with only some faint drag marks in the dirt and 2 sets of deep tire ruts leading away from the field. I set the mug down on the porch rail and stared, trying to process what I was seeing. These weren't just random acts of vandalism anymore. Someone had planned this. I didn't need to guess who was behind it. Karen had declared her mission loud and clear, and now it looked like she'd crossed the line from annoying to criminal. I didn't call it in right away. Instead, I went inside, changed into my uniform, and pulled out a GPS tracker I'd kept from a sting operation last fall. Then I grabbed 3 dummy bales I'd built for storage practice, each one filled with a core of scrap metal, old fire hoses, and a surprise layer of glitter-filled bait just for fun. Inside each one I placed a small motion-activated tracker and carefully stacked them right where the others had been taken. I figured if Karen or her little army came back for round 2, they'd take the bait without a clue. I didn't have to wait long. That night around 1:30 a.m., I watched the tracker feed light up on my laptop. The red dot blinked and started moving, slow and steady, heading north. I followed it in my unmarked pickup, tailing just far enough behind to avoid detection. After about 15 minutes, it came to a stop behind a row of bushes next to a familiar property. Karen's backyard. From the road, I could see the silhouettes of figures unloading the bales, dragging them onto the grass like they were setting up some kind of exhibit. Through my binoculars, I saw lawn chairs arranged in a semicircle, and a string of solar-powered garden lights illuminating what looked like a sign on a white easel. I pulled over 100 yards back and killed the engine. Then I messaged Mackenzie and 2 deputies to meet me nearby. We watched from the shadows as Karen walked around her backyard in a bathrobe, placing what looked like numbered placards on each hay bale. There were even laminated cards stuck into the sides of them describing their visual flaws. One said, "excessive browning." Another read, "undesirable rustic aroma." I rubbed my face, not knowing whether to laugh or press charges right there. The deputies arrived silently, parking behind the old church lot nearby. We met by the fence line. I explained the situation and showed them the live tracker feed. We moved in together on foot, flashlights off, boots sinking into the damp earth. As we reached the property line, I turned on my body cam and stepped into the beam of one of the garden lights. Karen looked up, startled. Her face went from smug to pale in a second. "Evening, Karen," I said. "Nice art installation." She froze, eyes darting between me and the other deputies who were fanning out behind me. "What are you doing here? This is private property," she stammered. I nodded. "You're right. But see, so is my hay. You're currently storing stolen property. And you moved it here without permission. That's felony theft and trespassing." She opened her mouth, then closed it. Then she tried the usual move, playing the victim. "I was just trying to beautify the area," she said. "I didn't know it was yours. I found them abandoned." "You're saying you found 6 200-pound hay bales abandoned and decided to make a sculpture garden," I said, taking out my notepad. "Yes. Well, maybe I thought they were public nuisance items. I was protecting the neighborhood. Karen, we have you on live tracker and surveillance cam taking them off my land. You crossed a locked gate, you moved marked property, and you're now trying to pass it off as some kind of community art project. This isn't the suburbs. This is theft of agricultural goods. I could haul you in tonight." Her face contorted. She turned to one of her so-called assistants, a thin, twitchy guy with a beard and no sense of urgency, and snapped at him to call her lawyer. The man instead took a step back and muttered, "I thought we had permission." She glared at him. "You do have permission. I gave it to you." I held up a hand. "That's not how that works. We cataloged each bale. We embedded a tracker. We have footage of your entry and exit. You're not just facing a warning this time. You're facing a court summons." At that, Karen completely cracked. She threw her clipboard across the yard and screamed, "This is harassment. I'm the one trying to improve the community. You're all a bunch of country thugs defending your hillbilly junkyards." Deputy Mackenzie raised an eyebrow. "That hillbilly junkyard is our food supply, ma'am. The hay goes to cattle. The cattle feed half this state. Your opinion of rural aesthetics doesn't carry much legal weight." Another deputy stepped forward and began photographing the scene. Karen tried to block the view with her robe, which only made her look more unhinged. I decided not to arrest her then and there. Not because I didn't have grounds, but because I wanted something better. Something public. A court summons would be a matter of record. A formal charge, tied to community property theft, backed with footage and signed statements. A full legal slap, open and documented. So I handed her the papers myself. Civil theft, trespassing, and impersonation of a municipal authority. She took them with trembling hands and spat, "This isn't over." I nodded. "No, it's not. The next time you see those hay bales, they'll be in an evidence locker. And the next time you trespass, you won't be screaming at us from your lawn. You'll be screaming through a holding cell window. We left her standing there under the garden lights with her stolen hay art display and her crushed sense of superiority. Back at the station, I filed the charges and reviewed the footage again. There was something both hilarious and sad about the whole thing. Karen didn't just hate hay. She hated not being in control. And that need, the itch to dominate everything around her, was going to destroy her more effectively than any court could. By sunrise, the story had already begun to spread. A deputy's cousin leaked a photo of Karen mid-scream next to a glitter-covered hay bale. It went viral on a rural meme page within hours. Captioned simply, "Don't touch the sheriff's hay." I couldn't have written it better myself. But Karen wasn't done. And something told me the next strike would come not through Bales or backyard art, but from a courtroom. And when that came, I'd be ready. Because she didn't just steal hay. She'd challenged the law itself. And that was a battle she couldn't win. The courthouse lobby was already buzzing when I walked in that morning. Small towns don't get many dramatic cases, and word had spread fast that the sheriff himself was at the center of one. People came out of pure curiosity, some with folded arms, some with coffee, others just hoping for another viral moment. Karen had filed a lawsuit against me for harassment, public defamation, and loss of potential community development revenue. She claimed the removal of her hay installation had stifled what she called a rural rejuvenation initiative. Her lawyer, a pompous out-of-towner named Milton Reed, strutted into the courtroom like he was about to argue in front of the Supreme Court. He wore a shiny blue suit, carried a briefcase big enough to hold regrets, and had that slick hairdo that made you question his life choices. Karen walked in behind him, wearing sunglasses indoors and acting like she was the wounded party in a true crime documentary. She glanced at the crowd, chin high, shoulders back, pretending the murmurs were admiration and not mockery. Her folder was bulging with fake HOA documents, cherry-picked screenshots, and printed-out articles from pseudo-legal blogs. On the other side of the courtroom, I sat with a single USB drive in my shirt pocket and a calm expression that said I wasn't here to win style points. I was here to end this once and for all. The judge, an older gentleman named Harold McIntyre, took his seat and looked at the paperwork for a solid 5 minutes before even speaking. When he did, he adjusted his glasses and gave Karen's lawyer a tired glance. "Mr. Reed, I've reviewed your complaint, and I must say, I'm already struggling to find a basis for most of these claims. Would you care to begin with your strongest argument?" Milton puffed his chest and began a 10-minute rant about small-town abuse of power, biased law enforcement, and the fragile nature of emerging community associations. He used phrases like aesthetic suppression and systemic agricultural intimidation, which were met with a mix of confusion and chuckles from the public benches. Karen nodded vigorously during the whole performance, like a bobblehead on a rickety shelf. When Milton finally finished, the judge turned to me and asked if I had a response. I nodded and stood up, speaking plainly. "Your Honor, all I ask is that we view the contents of this flash drive. It contains trail cam footage of the theft, audio recordings of Ms. Whitford issuing false claims about my property, and surveillance data from county equipment tracking the movement of stolen materials." Judge McIntyre leaned forward. "Very well, Sheriff Carson. Let's have a look." The lights dimmed slightly, and I plugged the drive into the court screen system. The footage began with Karen sneaking through my property at night, poking at hay bales, muttering to herself about mold content and symmetry. The courtroom was silent, except for the occasional stifled laugh. Then came the footage of her dragging the bales to her yard with a small team and arranging them like lawn ornaments, complete with placard. The cherry on top was a recorded phone call from a neighbor where Karen openly bragged about how she'd taken the hay situation into her own hands and taught the sheriff a lesson in visual balance. By the end of the playback, Milton was slouching in his chair and sweating through his collar. Karen looked like she'd been hit by a slow-moving freight train of truth. I turned back to the judge. "This isn't about hay, Your Honor. It's about someone who believes the law doesn't apply to her because she has a clipboard and a printer. She created a fake authority, lied to neighbors, trespassed, and stole property. Then, when caught, she pivoted to victimhood and filed a baseless lawsuit hoping to intimidate and distract. The real damage here isn't to her reputation, it's to the trust between neighbors. The judge sat back in his chair, arms crossed. Ms. Whitford, do you have anything to say in your defense after reviewing this footage? Karen stood slowly, eyes darting. Your Honor, I was under the impression I was forming a recognized HOA. I thought I had the authority to act on behalf of the neighborhood. I never intended harm. I just wanted order. You trespassed, the judge said flatly. You took what wasn't yours and lied about it publicly. That is not the pursuit of order. That is chaos wrapped in self-righteousness. He paused, scanning the courtroom before speaking again. This court finds the plaintiff's claims to be without merit and dismisses them entirely. Furthermore, I'm referring Ms. Whitford to the county attorney for review of potential charges including trespassing, impersonation of authority, and fraudulent misuse of community resources. As for the sheriff, I commend your restraint in handling this matter lawfully and professionally. Karen opened her mouth to protest, but Milton pulled her sleeve, whispering something urgent. She sat back down, trembling. The gavel dropped once. Court is adjourned. Outside the courtroom, the crowd exploded into conversation. Some clapped, others shook my hand. One man joked about turning the courtroom footage into a training video for rural defense. As I stepped into the sunlight, I saw Karen being escorted to her car by Milton, both of them looking like their careers had just been vaporized in real time. Someone had placed a tiny bale of straw on her windshield with a pink bow and a note that said, "Just let it go." The local paper ran the headline "Sheriff Beats Back HOA Tyrant in Hay Theft Showdown." It was a little dramatic, but accurate enough. I went back to the ranch that evening and fed the cattle as the sun dipped low behind the hills. The hay bales stood proud, untouched and perfectly stacked. I leaned on the fence and took a deep breath, letting the peace settle in. But peace doesn't last long when someone like Karen is still licking their wounds. And sure enough, that night, a neighbor called to tell me Karen had been seen talking to a man from out of town, someone dressed sharp, carrying blueprints. She may have lost the courtroom battle, but it looked like she was already planning her next move. Something told me it wasn't over yet. Not until Karen had either left town or completely self-destructed. And judging by her track record, the second option seemed a lot more likely. It was just past midnight when the alarm on the east perimeter fence pinged on my tablet. I sat up in bed, instantly awake the way only lawmen and ranchers seem to learn how to do. The motion sensor had picked up someone crossing the property line near the barn. It wasn't an animal this time either. Too upright. Too direct. I slid out of bed, pulled on my boots, grabbed the flashlight, and quietly made my way outside. The air was cool and still heavy with the scent of damp hay and cedar. The only sound was the soft clink of my belt as I crossed the gravel. As I approached the barn, I caught a flicker of movement near the side wall. A shadow ducked between the stacks of equipment. I turned off the flashlight and let my eyes adjust. Then I saw her. Karen. Dressed in black again, hood up, crouched low with something metallic in her hand. She was spray painting the side of the barn in big sloppy strokes. I stepped forward quietly and got within 10 feet before flicking on the light. The beam caught her mid-stroke, her hand frozen in the act of scrawling the words HOA Power across my wood paneling. She gasped and dropped the can, scrambling backward and slipping on a patch of hay. She landed hard with a thud and a yelp. I stepped into full view, flashlight steady hand on my hip. "Karen, we really have to stop meeting like this," I said calmly. She sat up, dazed, blinking against the light, then tried to recover her defiance. "This is symbolic," she muttered, "not vandalism. It's protected speech." "Not when it's on someone else's barn," I replied, "and especially not at 1 in the morning, while trespassing again." She pointed a shaky finger at me, still trying to find control. "You people, you don't understand vision. You cling to this outdated version of life. These bales and barns and dirt roads. It's chaos. Someone has to bring order. I stared at her for a moment, not with anger but with something closer to pity. You're not here to create order, Karen. You're here because you can't control the world, so you try to shrink it down to something you think you can boss around. But real communities aren't built by control. They're built by trust and respect and knowing when to leave your neighbor alone. She looked away, breathing heavily. Her energy was running out, and all that was left was desperation. I offered her a hand. She didn't take it. I didn't expect her to. Instead, I called it in. Deputy Mackenzie arrived 10 minutes later and walked her to the cruiser without cuffs but with that same quiet professionalism he always carried. She didn't argue this time. She just slumped into the back seat like a deflated balloon. The next morning I stood by the barn examining the half-finished graffiti. One of the ranch hands brought over a bucket of paint and a brush without me asking. He didn't say anything, just nodded once and got to work. Within an hour the wall looked like nothing had ever happened. Later that week I got a call from the county judge. Karen had accepted a plea deal. In exchange for dropping the criminal trespassing charges, she agreed to pay restitution for the stolen hay, complete community service, and to vacate the property within 30 days. She had also signed a binding agreement to never attempt to form an HOA in this county again. It was over. Or as over as things ever get with someone like her. The neighborhood held a small cookout that weekend to celebrate the return to peace. Doug brought ribs. June brought cobbler. Someone even set up a hay bale photo booth as a joke and called it the exhibit. Folks laughed, kids climbed the stacks, and the mood felt lighter than it had in months. We didn't talk much about Karen. We didn't have to. Her absence was the real celebration. A few days later I noticed something hanging on my fence. It was a laminated note stuck between two slats of wood with cheap twine. In blocky handwriting it read, "I still think your hay looks stupid." Below that was a tiny drawing of a house with a perfectly trimmed lawn and symmetrical bushes. I couldn't help but laugh. I took the note, brought it inside, and pinned it on the corkboard above my desk right next to the county map and a photo of my first cattle brand. It served as a reminder of what happens when people mistake authority for permission and personal taste for law. Weeks passed. Life returned to its normal rhythm. The bales were cut and stacked again for winter, the cattle grazed undisturbed, and the only drama left in town came from a teenager's failed dirt bike stunt near the creek. But then one day Mackenzie forwarded me a video. It had been posted to a Facebook group 2 towns over. There on screen stood Karen at a new city council meeting, furiously arguing about a scarecrow that had been placed too close to her new property line. She claimed it was a safety hazard and demanded an ordinance be passed against straw-based humanoid figures. I shook my head, grinning. Some people really don't learn. But at least now she wasn't our problem. Back at the ranch, I leaned against the fence watching the sunset paint the sky in gold and lavender. The hay bales stood in neat rows, silent sentinels of a hard-won peace. No one would ever mistake them for threats again. And if they did, well, I still had the badge, the land, and the law on my side. And that was more than enough.